All right. Okay, we're recording. I'm Shelly. I'm with the Christian Chronicle. I'm the digital news editor, and we are here with Alex Huffman. Alex, tell us about yourself.
Well, my name is Alex Huffman. I am an associate professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Denver, and my area of expertise is aerosol science. And so that was a word that no one knew until recently, and all of a sudden the world is interested in aerosols. So I'm also went to Pepperdine University and uh, Christian and attended a local church in the Denver area where I live.
Okay, great. Well, we appreciate you talking with us today. And yeah, you're right. Like, I don't know that I was ever very familiar with what you do until recently with the
Yeah.
pandemic. And your research has really become something that people want to know more about. So, kind of with the pandemic, kind of how has that impacted you and the work that you're doing?
So, of course, in to to first level, the pandemic has, as it has many other people in the country and the world, in that my daily routines were changed, and now I'm working from home in my basement as my kids are running around upstairs, and so I apologize if you hear any pounding or screaming. Um, and in terms of, and I did my teaching from this chair last quarter, so that was disruptive as it was for everyone else. But in terms of my professional side of things, so like I said, I can think of myself as an aerosol scientist as much as anything else. So my area of focus for the last few years has been the detection of biological aerosols, things like fungal spores and pollen and bacteria that float around in the atmosphere. And how do we detect those in real time, and what does it mean, and what does it mean for the environment and human health and all of these things? Um, I'm not specifically as focused on viral aerosols or respiratory aerosols, but that's very the particles that come out of your breath and that can contain viruses follow the same physics as all of these other things that we study all the time. And so there's no good real-time methods to detect viruses in the air, and so it gets quite a bit more complicated. But the community is working on all of these things. So from the perspective of what I do as an aerosol scientist, I have been thinking quite a bit and following colleagues who are really on the front lines of the research, both on the virology side of things and the aerosol transmission side of things, and really learning in real time, I feel like, with them, what they're disseminating that's happening in their research labs. It's not happening as much in my research lab, I should say. We're peripherally involved in this, but we're not on the front lines of the viral transmission side of things. But because I'm an aerosol scientist, I can take a lot of this information and I've been trying to do what I can to then translate that into my local church and into Facebook. I have a lot of Facebook friends who don't know anything about aerosols. Understandably, this is a complex area of interdisciplinary science. And so I've been trying to take that information and then disseminate it into the areas of the world that I have influence or connection. So that's been so I spent a lot of time with COVID related stuff, even during my professional hours of the day recently. One of which is to read and then disseminate some of that information into certain channels. And the other is that I'm working with the University of Denver, which is where I teach and do my research. I wrote a little module to help educate the community, the University of Denver community, on the airborne spread of the virus and how masks work and how we as a community can come together and be as safe as possible. So I wrote some modules that will be a part of the online required course that all students, faculty, and staff have to take. And I also have been doing some work with certain classrooms on campus to try to figure out exactly what we need to do to be as safe as possible in those places.
Yeah,
So I've spent a lot of time lately working on this.
I think you're like right now that it's like campuses are about to reopen. A lot of schools are deciding for sure, kind of here where we are, it's kind of back and forth. Are we opening? Are we not opening? Are we doing online? Like that. And then churches, the same question, like, should we open?
Absolutely.
Should we be in person? What are kind of the questions that you're getting maybe the most from the people in your circles and the advice that you're able to offer as far as weighing all of the options.
Yeah, and let me also just say one caveat up front, which is that I'm not a building scientist. I'm an aerosol scientist, and so that's a lot of these questions involve many different angles of questions, and it's an interdisciplinary science by nature. There are some who have really led the collection of data and answering questions about these things for decades. I don't pretend to be one of those, and I can list some of who those people are. And I've been learning quite a bit through Twitter and through email and conversations with those people. But at the same time, the aerosol science involved is relatively simple for an aerosol scientist. The physics and the engineering and the science involved in that follows all of what we have known for many decades. And so in that sense, I feel like I can translate some of what is being done now into some of the circles that I know well. So, but to answer your question about what kind of questions I've been getting, one of which is simply just what are some of the risks in, especially in a church environment. I've had a number of conversations with my local church, and what, I mean, as basic questions and direct questions is, what do we do? Should we meet? Should we return to meeting, or should we stay meeting online or in outdoor spaces and things like this? And so that's one question. And then I've gotten a lot of questions, especially on Facebook, from just friends who are school teachers and trying to decide, what can I do in my school to help improve things? And so the gist of that is actually relatively simple. As you get into the details, every situation is a little different. And so that's why it's hard to make blanket statements across the board everywhere. But the blanket statements are, there are multiple ways that the virus can be transmitted. One is being so someone who is infected, they breathe out material from respiratory fluid and from their mouths. And then that can fly out via droplets and either land on somebody's hands or faces, or something goes into their mucosal membrane somehow. They can also be on droplets that then land on surfaces that are then touched. And at that point, they're called fomites. And so someone touches them, and then they transfer that to some other surface of their surfaces. But oftentimes, those droplets, there are different ways we can think about this. There are relatively larger droplets that don't go very far and then they land. And then there are relatively smaller droplets or aerosols that go farther. Now, there's no real distinction between those two from a physical perspective. There's a continuum of these. There's some peaks in the size distribution, but there's no magical point at which it just all of a sudden falls down or all of a sudden keeps flying. And so there's been a little bit of confusion in exactly how we treat the biggest and the smallest of those particles. But the biggest of the particles do fall relatively quickly because they're big and gravity acts on them, they fall down. And that's basically where the 6-foot rule comes from, in that the droplets fall smaller. The big droplets fall quickly. But, and so in that context, the most important things are social distancing. We need to stay a bit away, especially in indoor spaces, because the concentration of the biggest and the smallest particles is largest if you are near someone. And then masks are absolutely critical in the discussion of public health and individual health. So those are by far the two most important pieces. But the smallest of those particles will transmit through masks to a little bit, but if you don't wear a mask, they come out at much higher concentration and now mix around the room. And so even if you're 6 feet away, these smaller particles will follow the air basically wherever it goes and stay in the air for many minutes or several hours. And so it doesn't matter if you're 6 feet away from someone. If you're breathing the same indoor air that other person is, then you're still being influenced or taking in the aerosol that they're breathing out. And so masks dramatically drop the emission of this and also the inhalation. But social distancing and masks are important, but that's where ventilation comes in. And so you're starting to hear more and more about this, that building aerosol scientists, I think, are starting to get this message out more and more, that if you can increase the ventilation rates in a room by increasing the air exchange with the air handling units, or if that doesn't work, if you can open doors and windows, whatever you can do to basically blow out the air more frequently in a room, then the relative concentration goes down, and therefore the risk goes down with it. And so I've been basically continuing to push that message and answering a lot of questions about, like, are masks really important? Absolutely, they're critical. They're the single most important tool that we have as a nation, as an individual community, as an individual to help stop the spread or the rate of the spread of this disease. And then answering various specifics in other scenarios as well. And one of which, for example, is people say, okay, how do I increase the ventilation rates in my room? I can't change the policies of my building or whatever to change that. And so just depending on the specifics of the situation, there are clever ideas that have been around for a while, but then are really being pushed more, like buy a box fan and put a HEPA filter for $20 from Home Depot or Lowe's or something like this, and basically duct tape it on. And you can actually move a huge amount of air through this thing that can really significantly increase the air ventilation rate in your room. Basically sucks the air through it and takes all the aerosol, runs it through, and even if there's virus in those particles, they get stuck to the filter. So there's little clever ways that you can increase the ventilation as well. And so
that's a really interesting idea. I think, like, especially for teachers or
exactly,
in the smaller rooms who are like, what am I supposed to do? That's a neat idea.
Yeah, and you do have to, you have to talk to your building manager in some situations just to make sure that you're not creating other ancillary problems. Like if you open a window and blow air in, that's great, but then in some situations what you're doing is taking that air and pushing it downwind, and if you have students in your classroom and they're infected, you're just pushing it downwind wherever the air is going, and that's not necessarily good. And that's actually one reason why air filtration in a room, whether it be a purchased module for a couple $100 or a box fan with a filter attached to it, you can actually circulate the air in your room and basically clean it out to a certain extent, but it doesn't change the net flow out of your room. So, but yeah, the problem with those is they're also really loud. So classrooms don't necessarily want a really big box fan in the corner. But so that's why every situation is a little bit different. But that's why I have been trying to do my best to let the real national and international leaders, of which there are a small number who I think are doing a really excellent job of pushing those messages out through the national media and various places. So I don't feel like there's a need for me to try to jump into that space. But in certain places where I feel like I have some credibility to say, look, I'm an aerosol scientist. I have no partisan agenda that I'm trying to push here. I just want people to have their questions answered and to learn and be safe and help their community be safe. I want to try to interject myself in those places. So that's been kind of my approach to this in the last couple months.
Well, as a member of the church, one thing we've heard about singing in churches and how some areas have asked people not to do that. Well, obviously, in members of Churches of Christ, that's a very large part of our worship service each week. And so have you had any conversations with your local churches about if they're meeting and singing, or if they're meeting outside, or kind of what they're doing there in your area?
Yeah, I have. And I want to be careful to not inadvertently bring any individual churches into it, to not. I think everybody's doing the best they can, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree.
My local church included. But
yeah, I have. Quickly, sometimes it's hard to know. Like this week, this was good. This next week, this may be good. So yeah, it's also fluid.
Absolutely. And I'll answer your question about that, because I think it's a really important one about singing and with respect to the Churches of Christ specifically. But I should also say that the overall I have gotten the feeling and the questions about via Facebook and friends and all these different places. Like, I feel like the recommendations are going left and right and kind of ping pong balling all over the place. And there is some truth to that, But I would say that that's not because the knowledge of the aerosol science is really going back and forth. I think it's the interpretation of that through certain leaders and the way that's maybe coming out in certain outlets. I think that the science behind it is pretty stable and has been known. There are certainly nuances that are absolutely coming to the fore, and that's really important. But the basic idea of basically be outside, put on a mask, increase ventilation rates, these are pretty basic aerosol concepts that are not swaying back and forth, and they won't. So that is a bedrock of the concept of the conversation here. So okay, just now to get back to answer your question about singing, it's an absolutely important one, because singing is, it sounds funny, but singing in an indoor environment when there's a probability of people being infected is a really dangerous indoor activity. And the reason for that is because when you breathe out, as people are well aware these days, you can be asymptomatic. You have something like 40% of people, depending on where you are, 40% of people who are infected have no symptoms. And even if you're breathing, and especially if you're singing, these aerosols and these droplets come out of your mouth and then can infect other people. And the louder you talk or the louder you sing, to a certain extent, the plume of droplets and aerosols gets significantly greater. The louder you sing, the more velocity and the more volume comes out of your mouth. And so that brings with it more aerosol, and it also goes a farther distance away from you. And so there have been some well-known studies in the last few months showing that some choirs in famous one, Skagit County, Washington, and others around the world have brought some significant amounts of infection in those spaces because simply people were singing. There was somebody that was asymptomatic and expelling those aerosols. And then I think in the Skagit County case, something like 85% of people in one choir practice were infected. And so it can be really dangerous to sing indoors, strangely enough. And as you said, the Churches of Christ, if churches have not been meeting in person locally, they really want to come back together, and I absolutely get that. And so there's a push and a yearning to come back together to do what makes the Church of Christ a family together, which is sing together. But that is one of the things that can increase the probabilities the most out of almost any activity you do. And so I've been talking locally, well, what does that mean? How do we do that? And so I think the first answer to that is, no matter, in all of this conversation, you can do this or that to try to reduce the risk of transmission, but nothing reduces that risk to zero unless you just lock yourself in a room, and nobody wants to do that. And so the question is doing this activity or this activity to bring down the risk enough to make it a palatable risk? Well, then we have to make a human decision on, is the lowered risk worth the reward that we get out of that? And to every person, that singing, the reward for one person or may be different than the reward for another one. So that risk versus reward ratio is complicated. But I can advise on the risk, and the risk is for singing indoors as a congregation is relatively high. And so I have been advising anywhere you possibly can, if you want to meet at this point, to meet outdoors for singing, because the ventilation rates are dramatically higher, and so it sweeps the airway. Still having some social distance to that is important, and still wearing masks is important. But outdoor activities like singing dramatically drops the likelihood of infection. And so I have basically been advising that if there is any, and all of this depends on the relative amount of the virus in the community. If you're in a location where there's almost no virus, well, the relative probability goes down quite a bit. But if you're in a place, and for the Churches of Christ, this is a really relevant statement because there are a lot of Churches of Christ in the South. And in the South, at the moment, there are also relatively higher infection rates than in other places in the country. And so those two pieces together mean that for the churches of Christ who want to sing indoors, you have to be really careful if you're in a place where there are high infection rates. And in those places, I highly recommend considering to do your singing activities outside at this point until the infection rates drop dramatically lower. That would be my first recommendation, pretty much full stop. Knowing that against my recommendation or against others' recommendations, that some groups will decide to still meet indoors to sing congregationally, the first thing I would say is the first things that matter for every other situation. One, socially distance, still be away from each other, and even more than 6 feet potentially from family groups, because as you're singing, those aerosols fly even farther. The other is wear your mask while singing. I know people kind of think, okay, I'll meet together, and then when I'm talking, I'll put my mask on, and then I'll take it off while I'm singing because it's more comfortable to do that. That's exactly the wrong thing to do, because it's when you're singing that you're expelling by far the most. So when singing, you have your mask on, and that will dramatically the rates of emission. So, and then beyond that, just like everywhere else, increase your ventilation rates as much as you possibly can, and that goes a long way. So, but I get it. I mean, I've been a member of the Church of Christ my whole life, basically. I've had, family members and preachers and elders and missionaries and pastors. So I'm a part of the Church of Christ community, and I get how important singing is, and it's important to me too. I love singing. I love worshiping, but I just think that the risk to the community is so much greater when we're singing indoors that we have to treat that very, very carefully at this point.
Yeah. What other advice would you offer, or what other, I guess, information do you feel like you can offer to people who maybe they're not sure? There's so much information out there right now. It's kind of hard to know, like, who do I really trust? And so as somebody who's a member of the church and who people may think, well, you're my brother in Christ, so I feel like I can trust you just out of that relationship there. What other things might you feel like are important for us to know, like, just right now, because there's so much information that sometimes it's just overwhelming.
Yeah, I get it. Maybe my first response would be not about the science itself, would simply be to say, this virus is real, and it really is a problem and dangerous for people who get it. And I realize there's a lot of conversation around this discussion about, and some people think this thing about it, some people think or believe this thing about it, but I would caution people from thinking about this disease, this virus and the associated disease as a partisan issue. This really should not be a partisan conversation. The virus and the disease associated with it does not care about your political leanings, your opinions on anything. It is real. And I get that some people have a distrust of certain media outlets for partisan reasons, and I get that. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been trying to speak into the spaces that I have available to me without any political perspective on that just in this context, I really encourage people to listen to the scientists and believe the scientists who have been working for their careers to try to learn and disseminate information about aerosols and viruses and pandemics and things like this. And so that's part of the space that I'm in, where so the first piece is just to say it's real, it's important, and we as a community need to work hard to follow the advice of people like me, but who and people higher up than me that are trying to make the best information available. And really, that the first and the best piece of that is what I keep coming back to: treat social distancing seriously and treat mask wearing seriously, and don't treat it as I'm strong, I can, or I see this as a political something, or it's attack on my civil liberties, or whatever these things are, you may believe those things personally, but ultimately the science is very confident about the fact that social distancing and masks will dramatically reduce the transmission in the community. And we also have to think a little bit about what is necessary and possible for an individual and what's necessary and possible for the community. And so for you as an individual, yes, you may or may not get the disease by not wearing a mask. But as has been coming up more and more and more these days, by not wearing a mask, you dramatically increase the likelihood that you as an asymptomatic carrier of the disease can transmit that to someone else. And so you really have to think very seriously about whether you feel enough care for your friend, your loved one, another member of the church, to then treat them with respect by putting your mask on. And so there's been all sorts of modeling done by really reputable scientists. If we as a national community would commit to wearing our masks in as much as possible, the rates of this disease would drop quickly and dramatically. And so so that's basically what we need to do. If we can just do social distancing and mask wearing, especially in these high-risk environments and by avoiding high-risk environments, then we can all get back to normal much faster. Now, there's all sorts of other conversations that are important about just wearing masks doesn't make the virus go away, and there's lots of complicating things, but the rates of the disease will go down dramatically. So that's what I keep pushing. It's really relatively simple from a disease transfer perspective. Social distancing and masks.
Yeah.
And to treat it seriously, and not to sort of get hung up on some of these ancillary issues of personal freedoms or civil liberties or distrust of the people who are bringing you this. I'd like people to trust scientists, or trust me as a member of the church and as a scientist, that this is important, and to do what the scientists are saying.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add? I feel like we've really covered everything pretty well here, but I'm open to.
I mean, I have all sorts of other thoughts, but I won't bore you with all the different tangents that my mind goes down.
That's
I would say, without trying to go down too much of a rabbit hole with this statement, I'll say, I think that getting back a little bit to your comment about singing, the Church of Christ, and the relationships there with this disease, the airborne nature of this disease, as linked with singing being really dangerous, especially the Church of Christ, puts the Church of Christ in an interesting situation, because lots of churches love to sing, and that's a part of many congregational activities. But in most church traditions, singing is not as intrinsically related to the experience, where you can go somewhere and maybe there's a choir singing on stage, or there are other ways to engage in that activity, or even just watch a worship service and you can still engage in that during the church service. But with the Church of Christ, that just doesn't fly. I mean, we sing together, and that's important. And so at the same time, and so the very activity that most people are in the top list of the activities that people want to re-engage in the most is one of the most dangerous. At the same time, churches in America, and churches of Christ are no different, church attendance and church numbers are dropping over these last decades. And so churches are in a financially precarious situation already with dropping attendance. And now you put this pandemic situation into that environment, and you take churches and put them on the precipice of financial implosion to a certain extent. And so there's some real pressures for the church, individual church body, to figure out what they need to do to exist as a congregation. And part of that means coming back together and being in person. I get that. for the small churches especially that don't have the resources, financial or personnel wise, to do all these activities online and things like this, but both large and small churches. And so it creates almost an existential threat on either side. If you come back together and do the activities that you want to do, you have you endanger the individuals in the congregation. But if you don't come back together, to a certain extent, you increase the threat on the organization as a whole, the church as a whole. And so that becomes a really difficult conversation, and I get that. And so one of the things that I've been saying to friends is that this pandemic is a pressure of sorts on the society and on the organization. And it is going to require adaptation of sorts in the short term, and I think in the long term. Adaptation from a biological perspective, from an organizational perspective, is required under a pressure, threats and pressures for an organization or a biological entity to survive requires us to adapt. And I think organizations and churches, individual churches, and really the whole fellowship at large, that is unwilling to adapt to these pressures, faces, from a biological perspective, faces death. But churches and anything else that allows themselves to think creatively in that situation to adapt amidst these pressures, I think has much more likelihood of pushing forward to survive. So I think that's an important thing that I have no philosophical answer to that, but I think it's worth pondering. Like, how do we take what's critical about who we are, but yet adapt to these pressures going forward, both now and then, knowing that this is not something that's going away immediately. And
yeah, it's interesting to think, like, right now it's summer coming into fall, like before too long. So outdoor services, it's hot, like in some places of the country, but at the same time, it's doable. Like, the longer this goes, the harder that may seem, as far as depending on where you are in the country and how cold it gets or whatever. So I think we're all hopeful that science will move as fast as possible, but also as safely as possible to hopefully see an end to this before long. But who knows?
Well, and then there's different creative solutions in as it gets into colder months, where you can have outfitter tents and put a big propane heater in the middle, which basically does all sorts of things to heat it up, but then blows the aerosols out the top, things like this. But the phrase that you just used, I think, is an important one that I want to speak to for just a second. You said something like, we hope that science will work as quickly as possible to do what we need to do. And that's true. There's truth there. So science is working on vaccines, and that's going to be a critical part of this in the long run. But what I would also say is, if we could convince all of our communities to be serious about this, be socially distant, treat it seriously, wear masks, science will still be creating a vaccine, but the number of cases would drop by orders of magnitude, by tenfold, hundredfold, I don't know. And so, yes, science has a critical role here, but every individual in the nation has a critical role in this, to treat it seriously and follow the recommendations. And whether science collectively produces a vaccine a month from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, if we treat it seriously, even as annoying as it is, to do the things that we need to do, those rates will come down such that people will not be sick and dying at the rates they are. So this is a collaboration between science and really every person in the country. That's what I would say.
Loving each other and doing the right thing.
Absolutely.
That science has proven will be effective.
Yeah.
So
Exactly. And so it following the recommendations to be socially distant and wear masks is the best thing you can do to show love to your fellow human, your fellow member of the body of Christ. So just like one part of the body doesn't want to hurt the other part of the body, this is a great way to show that by following the recommendation.
I think, change is hard, always. And to see a pandemic is something that none of us have really, I mean, the majority of us have never seen anything like this before. Maybe some people who are much older, but you just think about that is hard, and to wear a mask, it's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's not something we all want to do, but I think you made a good point that if it's something that's shown that it can help, then it's something we should all consider.
Yeah. And also, just to say, there are lots of resources. If people are interested in learning more, they can find them. I don't know how best to share those kind of things with, but there are some great people to follow on Twitter. There's lots of good articles that have been put together that have really laid out the science in a digestible way. I've collected a set of resources that I've disseminated to certain people as well. And so there's various ways to get engaged with that if you want to start to learn more as well. So.
Yeah, cool. Well, Alex, thank you. I appreciate it.